Hey guys, welcome back to the Mind of Brandon, and welcome back to another Sunday of Science and Spirituality. As indicated by the title of this video, it's going to be me versus Chris White versus Zeitgeist's Peter Joseph and Acharya S. So the inspiration for today's video is some commentary that I received on a series I recently uploaded called Was Zeitgeist Right? In that series, we looked at some of the controversial claims from Peter Joseph's Zeitgeist film, and we looked at some of the rebuttals from debunkers. And it turned out that if we address Zeitgeist claims on a case-by-case basis, I'm not always going to agree with what Zeitgeist is saying. Sometimes I agree more with the debunkers, but overall, it does appear that Zeitgeist is not quite as full of crap as the debunkers are making it out to be, and the overall point that Zeitgeist is making, that a lot of what we associate with Christian tradition has actually been handed down from pagan tradition, well, that's actually a valid point. But anyway, there's this guy who came into my comment section and started giving me crap for the choice of debunkers that I selected to respond to. He apparently thought I should have been responding to someone else. So this commenter shared a link with me to a video posted by a guy named Chris White, who was responding to an interview conducted by Peter Joseph, where he brought on Acharya S., who of course is one of the main references behind the claims in the Zeitgeist film. Acharya S., by the way, is also known as D.M. Murdoch. She's the author of the book Christ in Egypt, the Horus-Jesus Connection, which was basically a response to Zeitgeist debunkers. But Chris's video basically starts with straw man arguments, acting like he's responding to what they're saying, when what he's actually doing is responding to what he's pretending they're saying. For example, Murdoch explains why so much of this information is so hard to come by, and it's not always as easily accessible as just looking something up in an encyclopedia entry. So she's not saying that there's no evidence for any of this stuff. She's saying sometimes it requires extra digging. Sometimes it just takes more research than what people are typically used to. And Chris White twists and distorts this into, oh, she's saying that all the evidence has been destroyed, it's all been covered up, and so there's no evidence to substantiate the claims that she's making. Now, this, of course, is not what she's saying. To clarify, she does talk about some stuff being destroyed, covered up, whatever, but that's not the same thing as saying there's just no evidence for any of this. In fact, she goes over some of the evidence in the interview. And of course, there's parts of the interview that are just kind of barely scratching the surface when she actually goes into way more detail in her book.
Where does it say in the Egyptian writings, preferably, but really any other writing before 33 AD, that Horus was said to be born on December 25th?
Prior to 33 AD? Well, how about that calendar at the Edfu Temple of Horus? Which, of course, Murdoch covers in her book.
In fact, they include in the book the hieroglyph for the winter solstice. It shows the goddesses Isis and Nephthys on either side of the sun, holding like a baby sun over an ankh, giving life to the sun. This is the hieroglyph for the winter solstice.
So Murdoch actually talks about a hieroglyph depicting this in the interview, and then she goes on to talk about the importance of the winter solstice in ancient Egypt. To which Chris responds,
no one is really arguing any of those points.
Okay, it sounds then like Chris doesn't take an issue with this hieroglyph that she mentions, or with the interpretation that it's a depiction of life being given to the sun at the winter solstice, and this leaves one kind of scratching their head, wondering, well, what's the issue then?
The question is in regard to Horus's birth.
Okay, Chris, here's the hieroglyph that Murdoch is talking about. Now, who's the sun god in the Zeitgeist continuity? Oh, that's right. It's Horus.
It is, of course, incredibly noteworthy at this point to point out that Jesus was emphatically not born on December 25th. Even from a purely literary perspective, no ancient text that I'm aware of ever refers to a birth for Jesus on that day or any other day, and that the holiday was constructed several hundred years later, and it was actually based on ancient pagan practices that were established by Rome's version of Christianity in order to appease the pagans in Rome.
Oh, cool. He's actually admitting that this is something handed down to Christian tradition from pagan tradition, which, of course, is the point that we're trying to make.
This is why many Christians, like the earliest Christians, don't celebrate Christmas on that day, because it was widely known to be a pagan holiday. And so the early Christians, when they were told several hundred years later that they now had to begin celebrating Jesus' birthday on December 25th, they were very reluctant because they knew the Bible didn't say anything about it, but they did know that it was an ancient sun worship thing. So they refused, and often were killed for refusing. But remember, the question is, where does it say that Horus was born on December 25th?
When we're talking about the winter solstice, December 25th is fine to acknowledge, because it is part of the winter solstice, the 3-day period. Okay, so we have, for Horus, for example, we have this ancient testimony called Plutarch. Plutarch is about as close as we're going to get to a kind of a digest, an encyclopedia. Diodorus Siculus, before that, in the 1st century BC, also lays this out. Herodotus does a little bit, but not quite the same as writing kind of an encyclopedia entry type thing. Otherwise, we don't necessarily have this type of writing going back to these eras before that.
So in other words, she doesn't have any Egyptian claims whatsoever that Horus was born on December 25th.
Yeah, that's not what she's saying, Chris. She's talking about the earliest encyclopedia-style documents. And she already cited an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph that you didn't have any problem with.
Let me remind everyone that the question posed by the Zeitgeist Challenge website is to show any source before Christ that states any of this stuff. And she here tells us point blank that the best she has is Plutarch, who lived well after the death of Christ.
She tells us point blank that the best she's got is Plutarch. No, that's not what happened, Chris. And for crying out loud, if we're talking about the December 25th parallel, it's not really relevant when Christ supposedly died. What's relevant is, when did we start celebrating the birth of Christ on December 25th? And we started doing that in the 4th century of the Christian era, after Plutarch had already lived and died. Plutarch, of course, was born around the mid-1st century, died in the early part of the 2nd century.
We have this Plutarch specifically stating that Horus was born at the winter solstice. So what do we find out to corroborate that? We find out, first of all, that he's accurate in almost everything else he says, and this is stated by Egyptologists.
I disagree, and I will give a very logical reason why it is imperative to doubt Plutarch. Primarily because scholars of Plutarch recognize that it was his style in the book Parallel Lives to fabricate information about certain historical figures in order to make parallels.
Okay, first off, Murdoch isn't citing something from Parallel Lives. And if someone is accusing Plutarch of fabricating stuff, if someone's accusing Plutarch of lying, well, he's innocent until proven guilty. What is the actual evidence that he's lying? Second, this is just a fallacious personal attack on Plutarch's credibility that doesn't even address the pre-Christian archaeological evidence that corroborates what Plutarch is saying. We already talked about the calendar at the Edfu Temple of Horus, and we looked at a hieroglyph depicting the birth of Horus at the winter solstice. But anyway, Chris continues with a rather lengthy attack on Plutarch's credibility, even quoting from a kooky conspiracy theorist who talks about how Plutarch was this biased priest of Delphi. And I'm just thinking how ironic this is, that Chris is attacking Plutarch's credibility with a quote from a kooky conspiracy theorist?
Absolutely.
So what do we find? We find that, yes, indeed, the birth of the sun is discussed in inscriptions prior to the Common Era. We find also that there are temples to Raharakti, which is one of the aspects of the sun god, the Horus, Ra combination. These temples are aligned to the winter solstice rising sun.
An interesting point that Chris never responds to. But then Murdoch goes off on a tangent about how she's so loath to just give out some of this information, considering all the time and effort that went into her book, all the thorough investigation she had to do, and she's just, freely giving this stuff out. But then she points out,
the fact is that Horus is the morning sun on every day. Okay? So Horus is born every day of the year.
Interesting.
So if he wasn't born on December 25th, that would be the only day that he isn't born, according to the Egyptians. It's so ridiculous. Of course he's born on December 25th. He's born every single day.
Did you catch that? Now we have regressed to this. This was her, like, I hate to divulge this information that I dug up, but Horus was born every single day. Now, this means, of course, that Horus and I have a lot in common, because Horus was born, did you know this, on August 21st, which is the exact same day that I was born. That's pretty interesting. If it's really her explanation, the one that she dug up and is so proud of, then it really makes the movie Zeitgeist absolute mind control, because you watch that movie when it talks about this serious accusation that the Egyptian god Horus was said to have been born on December 25th, and they say that that's the same day that Jesus was born.
Once again, Chris is distorting the situation, acting like this is the big reveal that she's so proud of, when we've already talked about Plutarch and the archaeological evidence that corroborates what he's saying. Really, this thing about, Horus being born every single day, that's just kicking the dead horse at this point. But to clarify what's going on with these birthdays of Horus, and this is something I talked about in my Was Zeitgeist Right series, in addition to this concept that Horus is reborn on a daily basis, we do have several different annual birthday celebrations associated with different versions of Horus. For example, Horus the Elder has a birthday around the end of the Egyptian year on one of the Epagamenal days. And just a few days later, we have a birthday associated with another version of Horus called Ra Haraki, and that's used to kick off the new Egyptian year. And of course, around the time of the winter solstice, we have a birthday associated with a version of Horus called Harpocrates, Horus the Child. Skipping over some tangential stuff, eventually Chris starts attacking the credibility of another one of Zeitgeist's references, the Egyptologist Gerald Massey, who of course tells us about the calendar at the Edfu Temple of Horus, where Horus has a birthday associated with the winter solstice. But instead of addressing the archaeological evidence that Massey cites, Chris just accuses Massey of being a biased druid and then says this.
There are many people who do criticize Massey's Egyptian translations.
There are many people who criticize Massey's Egyptian translation. Doesn't say who these people are, or if they're even Egyptologists. Just, there's many people who criticize Massey's Egyptian translation. And if someone is in a position to know that Massey's translation is wrong, then they should be in a position to provide a more accurate translation that demonstrates that Massey's translation is wrong. Does Chris provide this alternative translation that demonstrates Massey is wrong? No. No, he doesn't.
And even modern supporters of Massey know that he was a self-taught Egyptologist who rarely cites sources about his important claims.
Except that Massey does provide a source with regard to this stuff about Horus having a birthday associated with the winter solstice. And he's not just a self-taught Egyptologist. He's a self-taught Egyptologist that closely worked with and was peer-reviewed by the leading Egyptologists of his day.
And while other debunkers like Keith Thompson have detailed this better, I would implore you to consider that if Massey was right and his translations were correct, why hasn't any modern Egyptologist confirmed any of it?
Actually, Murdoch does cite in her book, Modern Egyptologist Dr. Bojana Mojsov, who does corroborate this stuff about Horus having a birthday associated with the winter solstice.
You had mentioned the other Egyptologists such as Samuel Birch, he actually wrote a dictionary on hieroglyphics, if I remember correctly, and he was one that approved of many of Massey's writings. In fact, a lot of his own writings, I think, reflect the same information.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and it was Samuel Birch or Sharp.
Actually,
Samuel Sharp is the one who wrote about this information, but Samuel Birch is the one who did peer review Massey.
Right.
Quickly to expand on my earlier point is that Samuel Birch was born in 1813, and the Rosetta Stone was found in 1799, and it still took people quite a long time to even get to the very early stages of reading Egyptian hieroglyphs. By the 1820s, the first complete decipherment was made. So this is very, very early on in the understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Therefore, if Massey is correct, you're going to need more peer review than one done in the 1800s. You would need probably a modern scholar, unbiased scholar, to look at Gerald Massey and say, yeah, he was right, even though he had very little to work with.
Well, I don't want to rule out that Massey's translation might be outdated, but until a more up-to-date translation comes along that demonstrates Massey's translation is wrong, well, until that happens, Massey's translation is actually the most up-to-date translation that we have. Let me put it this way. If the renowned Egyptologist Bob Breyer came onto YouTube or the news or some Egypt documentary and said, hey, look, guys, I looked over the stuff that Massey talks about, and it turns out he's wrong. He says that it says this, but here's what it actually says. That's all that it would take. Okay? If that happened, I'd be like, oh, that settles it. Massey had outdated information. Here's the more up-to-date stuff. Okay? Those Zeitgeist debunkers, they were right about Massey the whole time. Right? That's all it would take. But that hasn't happened. So far, I'm not aware of any Egyptologists who have come along and been like, well, I was looking at the stuff Massey was talking about and he's wrong. Here's what it actually says. Okay? None. Okay? I actually emailed a whole bunch of different Egyptologists about this, saying, hey, here's what Massey says. Is he wrong? Does it say something else? The response was, so I gave a whole bunch of Egyptologists a chance to point out what's wrong with Massey's translation, and none of them took me up on it. So far, I know of at least one modern Egyptologist who agrees with Massey that Horus had a birthday associated with the winter solstice, and I haven't found any who have said there's something wrong with Massey's translation.
And if anyone's ever read his writings, they see, if you ever read Ancient Egypt, Light of the World, which is an amazing work, the only problem with that book to me is that he doesn't give enough sources.
There you have it. Don't take it from me. There's the creator of Zeitgeist who cited this guy 31 times. And when you cite a guy who doesn't cite sources, it's like not citing a source. If you say Gerald Massey said it was true, but Gerald Massey doesn't cite a source, then you've essentially cited no source, and this big list that Zeitgeist has provided is totally meaningless. That's the reason the Zeitgeist Challenge exists.
Once again, Chris is misconstruing the situation. PJ didn't say that Massey doesn't cite any of his sources. He says he doesn't cite enough. He did cite where he was getting this stuff about Horus having a birthday associated with the winter solstice. And so far, no Egyptologists have said, nope, that's wrong. Here's what it actually says.
So in any case, the information that we're talking about here does not rely on Massey.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm still waiting on some information. So far, I've heard that Plutarch was their source, and I heard that also Horus was born on every day, and so far that's basically what we have. So I'm still waiting for some actual sources.
Not fair, Chris. How could you forget me? How could you forget me?
Suffice it to say, Chris does not do an adequate job of debunking this December 25th parallel, and once PJ and Murdoch wrap up their discussion on that, they move on to this stuff about Isis Mary. So Murdoch talks about how in Egypt the word Mary means beloved, which is corroborated in this hieroglyph detective by the Egyptologist Nigel Strudwick. And of course, she talks about how the word Mary is attached to all sorts of different names, including, of course, Isis, which is corroborated with actual archaeological evidence.
Isis Mary.
So once you understand what's going on here, it's really easy to explain what's going on, but Chris decides to convolute the matter by going over the process that Murdoch used to figure out what was going on here. He accuses her of jumping through hoops to make it true. There's really no jumping through hoops, though. I mean, she's saying that Isis was called Isis Mary, and I showed you the hieroglyphs that back that up. So, Chris he's just twisting and distorting things again. He gives her crap for the fact that there's a bunch of different characters called Mary, so what's so special about Isis Mary? Completely neglecting to account for the fact that there's a bunch of Marys in the New Testament, right? In addition to having Mary, mother of Jesus, you also have Mary Magdalene and Mary, wife of Cleophas, Mary, sister of Martha and Lazarus, etc. And he acts like this whole Isis Mary thing is the only parallel that makes Isis seem like a precursor to the Virgin Mary when he knows that she says that Isis was considered a virgin. Something else I've seen Murdoch point out is the iconography of baby Horus with Mother Isis compared to the iconography of baby Jesus with Mother Mary. Okay, something that other Egyptologists have pointed out as well. Got here a quote from the Egyptologist Edmund Meltzer. He says, "The iconography of Horus either influenced or was appropriated in early Christian art. Isis and the baby Horus may often be seen as the precursor for Mary and the infant Jesus." So after this talk about this Isis Mary stuff, they move on to this stuff about Isis being a virgin.
Isis is specifically called the Great Virgin on the temple of Seti I at Abydos, which dates to, I think it was the 13th century BCE.
Now, this is one of those things that Chris has trouble corroborating with other sources because he's not reading the book, which, she cites references. She cites the Egyptologist Ray Witt, James Curl. They both refer to Isis as the Great Virgin.
But for the sake of argument, let's assume that she is right and that this is exactly how it reads at the Temple of Seti. The massive problem here is that we have a much different definition for virgin than the ancient Egyptians did.
No, we don't. It's just that the Egyptians had contradictions in their religious culture. Something which you should be all too familiar with, Chris. Now, Chris goes on to take a situation that's actually really easy to explain, but again, he convolutes it and misconstrues the situation. Now, as I explained in my Was Zeitgeist Right series, just as there's different versions of Horus, there's different versions of Isis. There's versions where she's a virgin, and there's versions where she isn't. So trying to make these different versions work with each other in a way that it seems like they're not contradictions, that's how we wind up with a concept like perpetual virginity, this idea that a deity can have sex yet maintain their virginity. This is a subject that PJ and Murdoch talk about. Chris weighs in on it. This does not mean that we have a different definition of the word virgin than the Egyptians did. In fact, they didn't have the word virgin. They had a word that translates as virgin, and the reason it translates is because it means roughly the same thing.
Isis being called the Great Virgin. Many other goddesses are talked about this way. The goddess Neith, who's somewhat interchangeable with Isis. We have her temple at Sais, which is pre-Christian, where she talks about no mortal has lifted up by cloth, and this is an indication that she's virginal. She doesn't come out and say, I'm the Great Virgin, which Isis does at the temple of Seti I. But she does say, I am untouched, and yet I bring forth the sun, S-U-N. So this motif is there, and it's solid. And
exactly.
yet, like I said, you can't just you have to point to these various elements of it.
And then Chris allows them to segue into another topic without expressing any problems with that last part. And then finally we come to this part about Horus being crucified. And, Murdoch admits there's nothing in Egypt about Horus, dying by being brutally nailed to a cross or anything like that. What this whole Horus was crucified parallel is about is basically like cross symbolism being associated with some version of Horus or another, right? As I pointed out in the Was Zeitgeist Right series, this stuff about Horus being crucified is basically an exaggeration. But of course, this exaggeration is based on a perfectly legit parallel that's totally worthy of being pointed out, as we do have imagery of a version of Horus in the form of a winged scarab, a symbol of resurrection, appearing on an Egyptian cross, a symbol of eternal life. definitely getting some parallel vibes to the whole Jesus thing, Jesus, dying on the cross and then being resurrected.
All of her answers to these questions about the Zeitgeist Challenge have had the same style, which is, well, no, he wasn't really crucified, or, no, well, I mean, he actually wasn't killed in any real sense, like we said in the movie, or he wasn't really born of a virgin. I mean, his mother wasn't actually a virgin when he gave birth to him. Or no, well, I mean, he wasn't actually, born on December 25th in one sense. I mean, he was born every day of the week, and I guess you might as well pick December 25th as any other. All of these are just, are lies.
No. Granted, the stuff about the crucifixion is a little exaggerated, but with the rest of that stuff, Chris, you're the one who's twisting and distorting the situation, and we already went over all that. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one. So have a good one, guys, and peace.